On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumner in South Carolina. Historians point to this as the beginning of the Civil War, either this or back in 1860 when South Carolina seceded from the Union. Several key events had led the nation to a boiling point that ultimately caused it to fracture and start the Civil War. Perhaps one of the most important issues took place in the small Kansas territory, and that historians often refer to as Bleeding Kansas. In 1820, the United States set a guideline for how the nation would continue to handle slavery in the territories going forward. The Missouri Compromise stated that slavery would be prohibited from the 3630 latitude line and up. This also set the precedent for every slave state, a free state had to be added, with Missouri being added and ultimately Maine being broken off from Massachusetts. The image I just showed you demonstrates the Missouri Compromise in reality and how it actually looked and affected the nation. Politicians at the time thought this would end the issue of slavery in the territories for good. As we know, the Civil War occurred and this did not fix it. So, how does Kansas fit in all this? The Kansas Territory sat right in the middle of this 3630 line. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise couldn't accurately decide what to do with the territory if the territory was right in the middle. As you'll see in the image, it clearly demonstrates that. With Kansas sitting right in the middle of this territory line, both politicians and citizens were wondering what the U.S. government would do to fix this problem. In May of 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This allowed for popular sovereignty in the Kansas territory over the issue of slavery. Popular sovereignty means the people in the territory get to choose if they want slavery to be around or not. As an American citizen, I can understand what the politicians at the time were thinking. America is a democracy, and we usually solve things very democratically, and that has worked for us. However, it did not necessarily work for us here. With the lack of federal oversight involving this popular sovereignty, there was no one to make sure that the voting was done peacefully or accurately. So many people from other states would come in and vote and just leave, and that would occur a lot. And because of this, there was no accurate way of doing the voting. Because of this idea of popular sovereignty and lack of federal oversight with this entire process, it was very easy for violence to occur, and violence definitely occurred. In the spring of 1855, heavily armed citizens of Missouri stormed over the border into Kansas and voted. Many of these people from Missouri were pro-slavery and were determined to see slavery occur in Kansas. These people from Missouri would not only vote for themselves pro-slavery, but they would also cram ballot boxes full of pro-slavery votes. Obviously, this would upset many people at the time and is very reminiscent of some issues that we have today, or at least people claim to have issues of voter fraud. As a result of this voter fraud, Kansas became a slave territory, and many pro-slavery laws were passed in this territory, including the banning of any pro-abolition newspaper or form of media. This is an obvious violation of the First Amendment and freedom of speech and the freedom of press. With the pro-slavery legislature continuing to pass pro-slavery laws, a group of Kansas citizens created their own government in Lawrence, Kansas, that was anti-slavery. This led to two different governments being created in the same territory. This will obviously lead to chaos. On May 21st, 1856, hundreds of pro-slavery people, mostly from Missouri, stormed into Lawrence, Kansas. They set fire to whatever buildings they felt like setting fire to. One of these buildings was the pro-abolitionist printing press that was set up in Lawrence. This extremely violent event is often referred to as the sacking of Lawrence or the sack of Lawrence. Next, you'll see a series of photos that depict and show the events that took place. The sack of Lawrence started a civil war that we often refer to as Bleeding Kansas that took place in the Kansas Territory between the pro- and anti-slavery governments at the time. It is important to know that before the sack of Lawrence, there had been several little dust-ups in the territory that involved violence, but nothing had come close to the scale of what the sack of Lawrence was. To some, Bleeding Kansas may have just seemed like a bunch of mountain men who were fighting and killing each other over small differences in the way they wanted their state to be governed. However, Bleeding Kansas had a serious effect in Washington as well as it did in Kansas. On May 19th and 20th, 1856, a Republican senator named Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gave a speech on the Senate floor that denounced the violence happening in Kansas. Sumner put a great deal of blame on the pro slavery government, as well as taking shots at many pro slavery people. Keep in mind, a good amount of the Senate at this time was in fact pro slavery. In this impassioned speech, Sumner called out Andrew Pickens Butler, a Democrat from South Carolina, as well as Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was also a Democrat. He would call out both of these senators personally and politically. This is the same Stephen Douglas who had become political rivals with Abraham Lincoln and be a huge part of the Lincoln Douglas debates, which are the modern style of political debates today. A few days later, a representative from South Carolina and the cousin to Senator Butler of South Carolina, named Preston Brooks, beat Charles Sumner to a pulp at his desk in the Senate. This display of violence became known as the caning of Charles Sumner. The caning of Charles Sumner led to one of the most iconic and famous pictures in American history from this time being created. You will see it in just a second. Back in Kansas, violence would continue. In May of 1856, John Brown would ruthlessly kill 5 Southerners. These Southerners did not own any slaves, but were known to be pro slavery. History today has a tough time deciding what it thinks of Brown. Some will see him as a hero who was doing whatever it took to end slavery. Others see him as a madman who went on a murderous rampage. Like I said, it's a very tough person to tell, and history tends to be unsure of how they feel about him. Personally, I believe him to be a madman. Anyone who goes around and murders people, whether their cause is valid or not, is a crazy person, and unfortunately, that is what I believe his role to be in history. Violence in Kansas would continue for another 3 years after John Brown's raid, till about 1859, when tensions would eventually calm down and eventually pick back up again when the Civil War would start in a few years. So, what exactly is Bleeding Kansas's legacy? It's a tough thing for us to interpret even today. After all, the Civil War would happen just a few years after the conflict would calm down, and the violence was over a good cause. After all, abolition is one of the best causes you could fight for. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this conflict needed to happen, even if it was fought for the right reasons. Obviously, the Civil War needed to happen, but Bleeding Kansas didn't necessarily need to, in my opinion. I think that if politicians had done a smarter job and maybe popular sovereignty could have worked, but with a little bit more of government oversight and boundaries, rules, etc., it could have worked. But all in all, it was a kind of a needless violence that could have been resolved just in the Civil War a few years later. But I can understand both arguments. After all, abolition is, like I said, the best cause you can fight for, and equality is an amazing cause to fight for. So that is Bleeding Kansas's legacy.